Bible in a minute. Genesis chapter 1. This is where it all begins. In the beginning, which is exactly what Genesis means. Beginning, origin, Bereshit. And here you thought it was just the name of a Phil Collins band. The chapter contains the creation poem depicting the 6 days of God creating everything. God said, "Let there be," and there was, and it was good. But before all this, we catch a glimpse of something else. The earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. This formless void, this face of the deep, is Tohu Vabohu, an echo of Tiamat from the Babylonian creation myth, and it reminds me where all this good creation begins. From chaos. Because even in the chaos of our world and our lives, the Spirit of God is hovering, calling forth beauty. And it is good.
Genesis chapter 2. If you know me, you know I love that chapter 2 opens with God finishing the work of creation begun in chapter 1 and resting. Here in chapter 2, God blesses the seventh day and calls it holy. Then we get the very poetic second creation story, where God makes a world, streams, gardens, creatures, humans. Is it true that men should dominate women because God made them first? Is it true that women are closer to God's perfection because God made them last and had time to get it right? Sadly, Genesis 2 has been a setup for so many struggles between the genders and who God loves best. I pray that we take a breath and drop our need to dominate one another and God's good and beautiful creation. Amen.
Genesis chapter 3. A crafty and manipulative snake coerces Eve into eating some fruit from the forbidden tree. She extends this fruit to Adam, who eats it, and they both discover that they are naked because their eyes have been opened. We learn that God goes on noisy walks. When God discovers Adam and Eve, God proclaims them to be cursed and explains the consequences of their actions. Then God clothes the disobedient pair and then sends them out of the Garden of Eden to protect them from the tree of eternal life. So, what kind of God are we dealing with here? A God who curses an entire species for having a forbidden snack? A God who goes on walks, is a fashion designer, and protects us from danger? Both?
Genesis chapter 4. And you already know this story. It's Cain and Abel. 2 brothers, one a farmer, one a shepherd. They both send up offerings to God. God looks at Cain's offering and is like, but looks at Abel's offering and gets real excited. And Cain gets big mad and murders Abel in a jealous rage. And what's fascinating about this story is that God doesn't shit on Cain's offering. Not like God looks at Cain and says, "Oh, you worthless excuse for a human, you'll never be good." God is just more excited about Abel because Abel puts all of himself into what he is given. For Cain, it's not actually about pleasing God. It's about being better than Abel in God's eyes. What we find here is a condemnation of religious supremacy, of a faith that is more about being better and more favored by God than somebody else. And that kind of faith kills.
Genesis chapter 5. This is the list of the descendants of Adam. Adam to Seth, to Enosh, to Kenan, to Mahalalel, to Jared, to Enoch, to Methuselah, to Lamech, to Noah. You might recognize some of these names. Enoch ended up walking with God. Methuselah was the really old one. And Noah? Do you need an ark? Because I know a guy. Now, bad Bible jokes aside, this is one of those chapters that you probably just skim right past, ready for the story to pick up with Noah and his infamous ark. But before you open your umbrella and move on to the impending precipitation, slow down and sit with these names. No, this is not a historical record of birth certificates, but it's a narrative history of the mythic characters who connect us from one global event to another, from the world's divine creation to its sudden and very wet destruction. And perhaps this list of names, stories really, invites you to reflect on the generations that have led to this moment and to your life. Whose shoulders are you standing upon? And where is your story headed next?
Genesis chapter 6. In this chapter, God witnesses the depravity and wickedness of humanity, and he finds a righteous person in Noah and tells Noah to build an ark. And while this chapter is full of questions and is a bit problematic, the Genesis writer says that the actions of humanity grieved God to his heart, meaning that this God has a heart, and a heart that is broken. And the thing about a broken heart is that a broken heart is a result of love. And so this God not only grieves, but this God is vulnerable. So I want to say to you is that it's okay to grieve. It's okay to hurt. It's okay to struggle. It's okay to be vulnerable, because when we are doing these things, we're not becoming ungodlike. We're embodying the love that God has, and we are now even worshiping God.
Genesis chapter 7. Content warning. Mass killing. God tells Noah, "You alone are righteous. Take your family, 2 of every kind of wild animal and 7 of every clean animal, and enter the ark." And God shuts them in. Noah is 600 years old. Rain begins to pour from the sky. Water begins to erupt from the ground. And it rains for 40 days and 40 nights. And everything on dry land, in whose nostrils is the breath of life, dies. Everything on dry land, in whose nostrils is the breath of life, dies.
Genesis 8. So Noah and his family and his menagerie won't be on the boat forever. God has remembered every living being on the ark and has made the waters subside. So Noah sends out a dove a couple of times for confirmation that there is indeed dry land. And after a little while, it's confirmed and they disembark. So Noah builds an altar, gives an offering, and God promises to never destroy every living being again. And if you remember of why they were put on the ark in the first place, the fact that humanity was wicked, it's interesting that humanity hasn't changed, but God's relationship to creation has somehow changed. There's a tension and a nuance. It's kind of like how clear the air is after a thunderstorm. And the importance is not the historicity of this story, but the highlighting that God's relationship with humanity and creation is interdependent. And just as importantly, humans' relationship with God directly affects creation. So that how we love God is how we love the earth. How we love the earth is how we love God, which is a pretty poignant word for today in the age of climate change.
Genesis chapter 9. God tells Noah and his kids to make babies, care for the earth. God hangs up God's bow and promises to never again destroy the earth. Phew. And then Noah plants a vineyard, makes some wine, drinks a bit too much, and one of his kids laughs at his naked body. Wait, what? This is the end to Noah's story. And while we're typically familiar with the story of Noah building a boat, your Sunday school teacher probably didn't tell you the part where Noah gets drunk. But yep, that's in the Bible too. And it makes me wonder, what led Noah to drink so much? Was he reflecting on his year living on a boat while the world around him died? Was he depressed at the thought of a God who would haphazardly hit the divine reset button, ending the lives of nearly every living creature? Was the rainbow, as beautiful as it might be, far from adequate in exchange for the rot and decay left by the receding waters? Is this Noah deconstructing his faith? The God he thought was good and loving, revealed to be something else?
Genesis chapter 10. Now, I know this is another genealogy, but don't skip this one. Typically, genealogies list the fathers and sons of each generation, but this one's a little bit different. This one names the sons of Noah, and then it goes on to say where each of their families and their descendants end up geographically. What this chapter does is it lists the names of tribes and nations and where they are located to show that they all eventually trace back to Noah's lineage. Now, this is pretty cool as a modern day reader. You see, as a people today, we all have our own families. We're all so different. We have different languages and cultures and traditions. We all belong to different lands, different countries, and different nations. And yet, somehow, we are all interconnected. We are all related to one another. What this chapter shows is that we are all children of our Creator God.
Genesis chapter 11. Now the whole world has one language and few words. And the people wander around a little bit. Then they stop and they say, let's build a city and a tower that reaches the heavens so that we will have a name for ourselves and so that we won't be scattered across the face of the earth. The Lord comes down to inspect this city and tower and says, they are one people with one language. This is just the beginning of what they could accomplish. Let us confuse their languages. That's why they call it Babel. They were scattered across the face of the earth. The chapter goes on to describe the descendants of Shem, son of Noah, all the way to Abram, showing that God rejects the power of the tower and instead chooses the power of the covenant.
Genesis chapter 12. And Abram went. These three words are the turning point in the book of Genesis. What had been a people tied to country and kin, honoring your family by carrying on their legacy, comes this rogue agent, Abram, who hears a voice telling him to go, and Abram went. We can so often become comfortable and complacent, content to be where we are because change requires risk, and risk means we might fail. So too often, we stay. But Abram went. Because for Abram, God's blessing doesn't come by staying put, but God's blessing will be found along the way. And this blessing is not something for him to hide and hold, but he is blessed to be a blessing. His journey will take God from here to everywhere. Abram went. And so perhaps we should too?
Genesis chapter 13. Abram and Sarai are out on the road and they run into some conflict. You see, Abram has acquired quite a few possessions, silver and gold, tents and flocks of animals, and his nephew Lot also has a lot of things. Pretty soon, Abram's sheep herders and Lot's sheep herders are at each other's throats. They're saying, there's a scarcity, there's not room for all of your things and all of our things in the same space. And Abram says, let's pause. There's enough room here. We're supposed to be united in kinship. So you go that way, we'll go that way, and we can continue in peace. This chapter makes me think about how we're often so concerned with our sense of private property or personal possessions that we overlook chances to serve one another as neighbors. God offers Abram this expansive vision of the world where there is enough to go around, enough time, enough space, enough resources. What would our world look like if we chose to protect our neighbors rather than our property?
Genesis chapter 14. Whoa, we're only 14 chapters in and already there's a war. 4 kings against 5 other kings. The 5 had been oppressed for 12 years, but in the 13th year, the 5 rebelled. It didn't go well for them. The 4 kings seized all their goods, all their food, and Abram's nephew Lot, who was living in Sodom. When Abram hears this, he assembles more than 300 men and recovers all the goods and his nephew along with his nephew's people. The king of Sodom greets Abram upon his return and blesses him. Give me the people, and you keep the goods. But Abram replies, I've sworn an oath to God and will accept nothing belonging to you, so that you cannot say that you made Abram rich. Who gave you your gifts, your abilities, your everything? Abram publicly declares from where his help has come. I've sworn an oath to God, and God has been faithful. May we all be as clear as Abram in declaring God and God alone as our source.
Genesis 15. This chapter asks 2 questions. Can Abraham trust, and can God be trusted? The answer to both is yes. Abraham can trust, but it's not a trust of resignation or subjection. He speaks freely with God, even protests God's promise, asking why and how he should trust this promise when all the evidence seems to be against it. In Abraham's frustration, God draws his attention to the stars and invites him into the incomprehensible awe and wonder of the night sky. If God can somehow create all this, surely somehow God can be trusted. And this trust is affirmed through the curious rituals and reflections found in the remainder of this chapter as a covenant is introduced. This assurance of covenant, how this promise will be practiced, fortifies Abraham's hope and trust in God as he and Sarah continue to live with barrenness until this promise is made good.
Genesis chapter 16. In this chapter, Sarai and Abram discover that they are unable to have children. And so Sarai gives her slave, Hagar, to Abram to use as a surrogate. Hagar conceives and loathes her mistress. And Sarai, in turn, turns her anger back to Abram. And Hagar flees. But in the wilderness, an angel of God appeared to Hagar, urged her to return to Sarai, saying, your offspring will outnumber the stars, and it will all start with this child, Ishmael. And Hagar gives God a name, saying, you are El Roi, the God who sees me. And so Hagar becomes the very first and only person in the Hebrew Bible to give God a name. She, a slave woman, teaches us that those who suffer injustice are often messengers from God.
Genesis chapter 17. This is a chapter where God creates a covenant of circumcision, everyone's favorite part of the Bible. This is a covenant between God and Abraham for every male who is 8 days old, and God says if a boy is not circumcised, he should be cut off from the people. This chapter is unique, and this covenant is strange. It's really intended to be a way to separate the Hebrew people from the communities that surround them, to mark them as distinct before God. And in this patriarchal culture, men represent everyone, so they're the only ones that have to have this mark done to them. The redemptive point of this scripture is that whether or not we adhere to circumcision, it evokes a question that many Christians ask every Lent. What are we willing to give up in order to be closer to God? Are we willing to be intentionally uncomfortable as we follow Jesus and do what is right? This is always a question worth pondering.
Genesis 18. Some mysterious visitors appear at Abraham's tent with an earth-shattering message. Sarah will give birth to a son. This is to fulfill God's promise that this couple will be the origin of a great nation. But there's just one huge problem with this promise. This couple is old. Sarah is postmenopausal, so when she receives the news that she's going to have a baby, she laughs. Who wouldn't? Our culture abounds with negative stereotypes of old age as a time of boredom or stagnation or just reliving the glory days. This chapter points in a very different direction, depicting old age as a time of new life and surprise, sexual pleasure and laughter, and an ever-evolving faith. The horizons of hope expand for Sarah and Abraham as they age. And maybe they can expand for us too as we age.
Genesis 19. Lot protects 2 male angels he has invited into his home. Men of the town seek to humiliate Lot's guests, as raping a man is the ultimate degradation. Women were disposable, so Lot's instinct is to discard his virgin daughters to the crowd at the cost of saving the strangers. Also not surprising that Lot's daughters would conceive children by their father in order to increase their worth. In the books Isaiah, Jeremiah, Zephaniah, and more, Sodom and Gomorrah are described as oppressive, arrogant, and abusing their power. This chapter focuses on a forsaken place and people so wicked that not even 10 decent people could be found to save it. The real sin of Sodom and Gomorrah is hostile welcome, and the implication that this chapter has anything to do with consensual same-sex relationships is completely false. We can change that narrative. Lives depend on it.
Genesis chapter 20. Sometimes I'm convinced that the Bible is a soap opera. Abraham and Sarah are traveling. They arrive in Gerar, and Abraham is afraid that the king will kill him and take his wife, so he passes her off as his sister. King Abimelech takes her anyway. Really, this whole sister charade only served to protect Abraham's life. Now God is pissed because Abraham is God's current favorite, and God doesn't want some random king taking his favorite's wife, and so naturally God threatens to kill the king, and God closes fast the wombs of the house of Abimelech. Abimelech defends himself, pleading innocence since Abraham had introduced Sarah as his sister rather than his wife. God says, send her back, or you and your whole family will die. Okay, God, maybe tone down the death threats a bit. Abimelech calls for Abraham and asks him, what were you thinking? Abraham explains the whole thing. I thought you would kill me, and they end up working it all out. But still, talk about unnecessary drama. Moral of the story, if that's even possible, don't tell people your spouse is your sibling. And if you're God, cool it with the death threats.
Genesis chapter 21, Isaac is born, and Sarah names him Laughter because she's delighted, but she's not laughing very hard when she observes Ishmael mocking or playing with or poking fun at, we're not sure, but she wants Hagar and Ishmael out of there. Now, Abraham isn't really too keen on this idea because that's his son, but God says, go ahead, send him away as Sarah is asking you to, because your line is going to come through the descendants of Isaac, and I will make a nation of Ishmael. Well, they abandon Hagar and Ishmael in the desert. This does not go well physically, and they begin to die. God hears the cries of Ishmael and comes to Hagar's aid. Ishmael grows up to be a skilled archer, and he marries an Egyptian. Back to Abraham, they have a land dispute over a well. It's settled. They call it Beersheba because they settled it by an oath. And all I can think of is, wait. God told Abraham to cast away his son? What?
Genesis 22. In this story, we are confronted with the binding of Isaac, where God tests Abraham by asking him to sacrifice his only son. And Abraham goes along with it. We get to the point in the story where Abraham has the knife overhead over his son's body, ready to strike, where the angel of the Lord says, "Do not do this. I will provide a sacrifice instead." Now, we may read this as modern readers and be horrified. How could God do this? But an ancient reader may see this differently. Abraham was not surprised by God's ask, by the test. Abraham knew that the gods of his culture routinely asked people to sacrifice their children. The good news of the story is that God is not like the other gods. God does not ask you to sacrifice your child, will stop you from sacrificing your children, and in fact will provide another way forward. This is good news, that God is not one who requires sacrifice, but is a God of mercy.
Genesis chapter 23. Abraham and Sarah were called by God to leave their home and all that was familiar to them to pursue God's promise. Their sojourns had taken them to Egypt, Gerar, and Philistia, and now in the town of Hebron, Sarah had passed away. Abraham needed to find a burial place for her. Farmable land was precious and carefully handed down from one generation to the next, so when Abraham asked for a place to bury Sarah, the entire community was involved. The landowner Ephron and Abraham negotiated the terms of the deal in front of everyone at the city gate. This was a way of keeping the peace and avoiding any disputes in the future. And in the end, an agreement was made. Abraham paid the asking price, and Sarah was buried in the cave, which eventually became the tomb of the three couples, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah. This story illustrates the importance of respecting the people and cultures around us if we're all to live in peace together.
Genesis 24. Abraham is old, which is a recurring theme throughout most of his story, but now it's time for his son Isaac to get married. Otherwise, the whole generations as numerous as the stars of the sky promise won't really get very far. And so, Abraham sends his servant to find a wife for his son, only he has one condition. She can't be from the Canaanites, their current neighbors. Abraham insists that his servant go back to his family, back to the home he so boldly left 13 chapters ago. And so, Abraham's servant returns home, and after a semi-elaborate test involving giving water to his camels, he meets Rebekah and tells her the news. "You're the one. You're going to marry Abraham's son, Isaac." And we thought that all these dating apps made things complicated. Rebekah returns with Abraham's servant to marry Isaac, and God's promise to bless Abraham with a family can go on. I find it interesting, though, that Abraham insists on going back in order to move forward, because sometimes we can fear the unknown and we revert back to where we are comfortable and function from there. And it's not that this is implicitly wrong, but what would it look like for us to trust where God is leading us rather than to insist on returning to where we've been?
Genesis 25. Abraham was married to Sarah, but he also had a child by Hagar, and he sent her away, and that was Ishmael. Abraham had a third wife. Who knew Abraham had a third wife? I didn't even know that. His son's name was Isaac. Isaac marries Rebekah. Rebekah has twins, Jacob and Esau, who are fighting from the time they were in the womb, and then Jacob steals Esau's blessing and writes in the family. Every time we think about biblical families as being some sort of unattainable standard of goodness or uniformity, we read the Bible and we see that we have been a mess and a mess of conflict and misunderstanding from the beginning. The good news? We are a mess that belongs to God, and each one of us is a shining shard of God's love that makes up this beauty of the universe, no matter how flawed we are and no matter how hard a time we have getting along.
Genesis chapter 26. Bible in a minute. Genesis chapter 26. Do you have deja vu yet? Do you have Abraham, Isaac deja vu yet? God promises to Abraham that his descendants will be blessed. God promises to Isaac that his descendants will be blessed. Abraham lies about the identity of his wife. Isaac lies about the identity of his wife. Abraham has disputes about wells. Isaac has disputes about wells. Abraham has a son whom he others. Isaac has a son whom he others. So if history keeps repeating itself and no story is new, then there are Abrahams and Isaacs who appear to get the blessings, and then there's Rebekahs and Sarahs, Ishmaels and Esau's who are othered in this story. So what does that mean for us today? Are you feeling like a Rebekah or an Esau or an Isaac or Abraham?
Genesis 27. This is the story where Jacob goes to great lengths to deceive his father Isaac in order to acquire the blessing rightfully meant for his elder twin brother Esau. Jacob and Esau's mother Rebekah overheard Isaac telling Esau, "Behold, I am old. I do not know the day of my death," which is biblical time's way of saying, "Listen carefully, I'm about to die." With the help of his mother, Jacob was successful in tricking his father Isaac into blessing him. Blessing in that time was a solemn declaration that transfers property rights and the authority of the father to the one receiving the blessing. It was effectively a will, only instantaneous and irreversible. To give a blessing in that time was final. This passage often raises questions about morality. Why does it seem as though Jacob is rewarded for his trickery? And does this mean that it's okay for us to be deceitful and manipulative to get what we want in life? Before we run with that thought, though, it might be a good idea to read the rest of Jacob's story to see just how complicated life can be.
Genesis chapter 28. Jacob is on his way to his uncle Laban. He stops for the night and finds a rock for a pillow, interesting choice, and has a Led Zeppelin-inspiring dream of a stairway to heaven. He wakes up to realize what's been true all along, only he's been too preoccupied to even notice. He says, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, rocks and seas and skies and trees, and when we open our eyes, we just might begin to notice God in all of it, even under a rock, like Jacob did.
Chapter 29. Jacob is tricked by his uncle Laban. You see, he had the hots for Laban's daughter, Rachel, and made a deal with his uncle that he would work for 7 years in exchange for Rachel's hand in marriage. 7 years pass, and after all the wedding festivities, Laban double-crosses Jacob, sending his unwedded, older, and less attractive daughter, Leah, to bed Jacob on his wedding night, instead of Rachel. I don't know how, but Jacob doesn't notice until the next morning. Furious, he then has to work another 7 years so that he can marry Rachel, the one he loved more. But the real victim in this story is not Jacob. It is Leah, who is left feeling unloved and rejected by the men in her life. Let the story be a challenge for us to examine the ways in which we harm women when we reduce their value to their looks or their fertility.
Genesis chapter 30. Jacob is a trickster. We see Jacob ready to leave his uncle Laban. They work out a deal where Jacob gets to take all the spotted, speckled, and black sheep and goats, leaving Laban with the coveted pure white livestock, and they separate the flocks by a 3 days journey. And then this is where things get really interesting. Jacob takes fresh poplar and almond rods and peels white streaks into them, exposing the white of the rods, and then when the stronger of the flock come to the troughs to drink and breed, he places them in front of the sheep, which of course makes them produce offspring that are striped, speckled, and spotted, because yeah, that's how animal breeding works, right? And all of this led to Jacob's unwanted flock growing larger and stronger than his uncle's pure and white flock. Now, this is obviously a legendary story that has Jacob living up to his name as the trickster, but it also shows us how these stories are crafted in hindsight, an embellished retelling of our past to make meaning of where we've ended up. And if we're honest, that's what we tend to do with most of our memories.
Genesis chapter 31, in-law drama. Jacob and Laban are not getting along, and that is because Laban keeps trying to cheat Jacob by saying, in the spring, you can have all of the lambs that are born that are speckled. But God is on Jacob's side, and coincidentally, all the lambs that are born are speckled, and Jacob gets a disproportionate amount of wealth from this over and over, and Laban is annoyed. So his favor turns against Jacob, and Jacob realizes this, and under the cover of night escapes with all of his livestock, family, everything. Laban is angry about this and chases him down. They have a settlement agreement in front of a pile of rocks, and then Laban says to him after they've had dinner, "The Lord watch between us as we depart from each other." Now, people say this as a blessing to one another all the time these days, but what Laban really meant is God is watching you.
Genesis chapter 32. In this chapter, Jacob is fixing to go home for the first time to meet his brother after running away, after stealing his brother's inheritance. And he is scared because he thinks that Esau is still angry at him and wants to kill him. And he can't sleep. And while he's up all night, he sees an angel of the Lord and they start wrestling naturally. And at the end of this wrestling match, God gives Jacob a new name, saying that you're no longer Jacob, but you are Israel, because you have struggled against humans and God and have won. And the thing about struggle is that struggle is a function of life, because if you're not struggling, you're not living. You're not alive. So it's okay to struggle. To struggle means that you are alive. And in our struggles, we are never alone because first, God has given us the gift of community. And secondly, God is always with us, even in our struggles.
Genesis chapter 33. Jacob is heading home, and big brother Esau is coming to meet little brother Jacob, who tricked him and robbed him. Esau's coming with 400 men. When I told my kid Esau was coming with 400 men and asked, what do you think that means? They said, Jacob's going to get his behind kicked. That's what you'd think, right? Except it never happens. Esau comes running to meet little brother Jacob. He embraces him and covers his face in kisses. Wow, what a welcome. The brothers weep, and Esau says, introduce me to your family, little bro. Then Esau asks, why all the gifts? To which Jacob replies, I was trying to find favor in your eyes. In other words, hoping you wouldn't beat me up. And Esau says, keep your wealth, brother. I've got plenty. But Jacob insists because he's just so grateful to see his big brother again. Seeing your face, he says to Esau, is like seeing the face of God. What a love. And what an example for us to follow.
Genesis 34. So Leah and Jacob have a daughter named Dinah, who went to visit the women of the land near the pagan city of Shechem. While there, Hamar's son Shechem saw Dinah and he raped her. When the news about Dinah came to Jacob's sons, Dinah's brother, they were filled with anger. Hamar's son Shechem was deeply in love with Dinah, and he wanted to make Dinah his wife. A proposal was made by Jacob's sons in regard to circumcision. The agreement was for every male to be circumcised in order to marry Dinah. But upon their agreement, Simeon and Levi, Jacob's sons, Dinah's brother, went throughout the land, the city, killing every male, including Hamar and Shechem.
Genesis chapter 35. Jacob's journey home continues, and his newly changed name from Jacob to Israel, from trickster to struggles with God, is reinforced. And it's in these final stages of their journey that his favorite wife dies during the birth of his 12th son. Rachel, in her final breath, names this son Ben-Oni, which means son of my sorrow. But Jacob, high off his newly changed name, decides to change the name of what will become his favorite son from Ben-Oni to Benjamin, from son of my sorrow to son of the right hand. Now, this is interesting for a lot of reasons. Typically, the firstborn son would be the favorite and the one to sit at this prestigious right hand, but here we see it's the younger son. A reminder that Jacob himself was the youngest who tricked his way into the family blessing. And second, it's interesting the way these stories so casually drown out the voices of women. Sorry, Rachel, even though it was your literal dying wish, we're going to change his name. What would it look like for us to intentionally hear and honor the voices of women, both in the Bible and in our world today?
Genesis chapter 36. This whole chapter is dedicated to the genealogy of Esau, who is commonly remembered as the one who exchanged his birthrights for a bowl of soup. He is one of Scripture's earliest examples of somebody who is not chosen. We as Christians, especially Christians of the West, we see ourselves as chosen people, right? We think that we are the ones for whom God rushes in, destroys our enemies just to protect. But the Old Testament, dedicating a whole chapter to the genealogy, the history of somebody who doesn't take that particular path, tells us two things. One, God cares for and values all people. And two, if God cares and values the dignity of all people, then we are to live into the baptismal vows that we make when we say that I will honor and uphold the dignity of every human being. Because God cares, we are to care.
Genesis chapter 37. Following in the pattern of Abraham and Isaac, Jacob too has a favorite son. It's the son of his wife, Rachel, and his name is Joseph. He loves Joseph and gives him a beautiful coat. Joseph starts having dreams about his whole family bowing down to him, and all of this really enrages his brothers. And the brothers decide they're going to kill Joseph. One brother rescues him by saying, instead of killing him, let's throw him in a pit in the wilderness. That brother's name was Reuben. Reuben goes to retrieve Joseph from the pit and discovers that it's empty. His brothers have sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites, who then sell him to Egypt. But they have to tell Jacob something, so they bring back the coat dipped in blood and tell Jacob that the brother, Joseph, is dead. Jacob is inconsolable. How will he ever go on? Who cares about the other 11 brothers? Joseph is dead. Or is he?
Genesis chapter 38. Judah has 3 sons. His firstborn marries Tamar, but he dies and they haven't had a kid yet, so in order for the family line to continue, the next brother has to fill in. But then brother number 2 dies. Brother number 3 is still a kid, but Judah tells Tamar that when he's old enough, they can get married. Only years later, Tamar sees that baby brother's all grown up, but Judah has not followed through on his promise. So she veils her face, pretends to be a prostitute. Judah picks her up from the side of the road, not knowing who she really is. Let's do this. What will you give me? How about a baby goat from my flock? Okay, but give me your signet and cord and staff. Later, Judah sends the goat, but the prostitute can't be found. And then 3 months later, scandal breaks out. Your daughter-in-law Tamar has prostituted herself. Moreover, she's pregnant as a result of the prostitution. Bring her out and let her be burned. She comes out holding the signet and cord and staff. These belong to the father. He hadn't followed through on his promise with his youngest son, and so Tamar did what she had to do to ensure her safety. In a patriarchal society where women are treated as property rather than people, this is a story about a woman who controls her own fate.
Genesis chapter 39. In this chapter, Joseph is sold into slavery in Egypt and finds favor with Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials. Potiphar places Joseph in charge of his entire house, and God blesses Potiphar because he has cared for Joseph. But while Joseph is tending to his house, Potiphar's wife tries to sleep with him because he's apparently so handsome. Joseph persistently refuses, but one day Potiphar's wife grabs Joseph by his coat, and Joseph runs off naked. The wife makes a scene and tries to blame Joseph for trying to sleep with her. This is what she tells Potiphar when he refers home. So Potiphar has Joseph thrown into prison. But even in prison, God is with Joseph, and Joseph finds favor with the prison warden, who makes him in charge of the entire prison. He just can't lose. The point of this story is as simple as it gets. Do the right thing, and God will be with you. Short and to the point.
Genesis 40. Joseph was in prison for something he didn't even do, and he was forgotten. But Joseph already knew a God who could make a way out of no way. I can hear him now humming, hold on, just a little bit longer. Hold on, just a little bit longer. Hold on, just a little bit longer. Everything is gonna be all right. And Joseph experienced the power of God. Stay tuned.
Genesis chapter 41. Joseph is still in prison, but over in the palace, Pharaoh wakes from not 1, but 2 startling dreams. The first is about 7 thin cows eating 7 healthy cows, and the second is about 7 thin ears of grain consuming 7 healthy ones. Desperate to know what they mean, he asks for someone to interpret them. The chief cupbearer recalls his time in prison 2 years ago, where he met someone with a knack for interpreting dreams. And so Pharaoh calls for Joseph. Joseph explains that the dreams foretell 7 upcoming years of abundance, followed by 7 impending years of famine. And he goes on to prescribe a solution. Take 20% from the good years, store it away, and then we'll have enough to make it through the 7 years that follow. Sounds like a plan. And since you're good with dreams, you'll be in charge of it. And so Joseph finds himself second in command over all of Egypt. The next 7 years go exactly as predicted, leaving all of Egypt and all the world to come to Joseph to buy grain. I wonder how this famine is impacting Joseph's father and his brothers.
Genesis chapter 42. The main figure of this passage is Joseph and the family drama that he has with his brothers, who did sell him into slavery after all. Many years after that, Joseph now holds a position of power and prophecy in Egypt during a devastating famine. His estranged and now hungry brothers, unaware of his identity, come seeking food. However, Joseph recognizes them and is kind of mean to them. He chooses to test them, eventually detaining Simeon, and demands the youngest brother, Benjamin, be brought on the risky journey to Egypt. The brothers, feeling these tests, start to have guilt over their past betrayal of Joseph. They have a heartfelt conversation in his presence, unaware that he understands what they are saying. There could be reconciliation, eventually. For now, we are to reflect on the complexities of forgiveness and growth, especially within family systems. And the story is far from over. We are left in the in-between time, the tension before reconciliation.
Genesis chapter 43. Israel's sons are out of food again, and they need to go to Egypt to get more food during this time of famine. But they were told that they may not return unless they bring their youngest brother, Benjamin. So the sons go to Israel, Jacob, and request to bring Benjamin with them on this trek to get more food. And Jacob does not feel good about this. This is his second favorite son. And yes, he has a second favorite son. But eventually he relents and Benjamin goes with his brothers to Egypt. When they arrive, Joseph recognizes Benjamin and is overcome with emotion and love. He has to leave the room because he's weeping. He has to pull himself together and come back. He receives the brothers. He offers them a lavish meal. And in fact, he gives his favorite brother 5 times the serving of everyone else. You have to wonder, when is all of this favoritism going to end? Or will it ever?
Genesis 44, aka what Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat left out. Joseph has his steward place a silver cup in Benjamin's food bag and then accuses him of stealing it and decides to make Benjamin a slave as punishment. But brother Judah speaks up about the implications for their father and their family if young Benny can't return home. Joseph is trying to gauge the possibility of building a trusting relationship with his brothers by devising this test, but their response to the accusation isn't about guilt or innocence. Rather, it reveals the dedication, care, love, concern, and respect the brothers have for their father and their family. It raises so many questions. Like, how do you repair broken trust? What would have happened if Joseph had initially revealed himself to his brothers? How do you let your past hurts influence your present? And what are the implications of that influence on generations past and present? God, give us the opportunity to observe growth in others, practice trust, and extend grace. Amen.
Genesis chapter 45. Joseph finally breaks, weeping and revealing himself to his brothers. He tells them that the famine still has 5 years to go, but they can all move to Egypt and he'll make sure that they're okay. Which is great and all, this generosity towards his family, but it's interesting that everyone else still has to pay. Egypt turning this famine into a financial win, filling their banks as people struggle to fill their bellies. Now, maybe I'm just a bit skeptical of Joseph by this point. He had so many opportunities to drop the charade, but instead he kept messing with his brothers like a vindictive younger sibling reeling from their own unaddressed trauma. And in the end, he interprets it all as, God brought me here for a purpose, to save you and the whole world. I guess in hindsight, you really can see anything you want.
Genesis chapter 46. Jacob makes his way to Egypt, taking his entire family. That's both his wives, Rachel and Leah, both their servants, Zilpah and Bilhah, all 12 of his sons and all their children, his only daughter Dinah and all her children. That's 3 generations of people. And he was scared. But he had to leave because there was a severe famine and he wanted to keep his family alive. God gives him courage and speaks to him in a dream saying, "Do not be afraid," promising that God's self will journey with Jacob and his family. Jacob's trek reminds me of the many caravans of families who journey to our southern borders with few options left for survival. I imagine that for many of them, they too have been encouraged by visions of the night where God has also said, "Do not be afraid, for I myself will go with you."
Genesis 47. This chapter shows us the 2 sides of our character Joseph. The one who's going to make sure that his family is provided for, that they have land and property to care for themselves, and the shrewd administrator who, as the famine gets worse, consolidates power to Pharaoh, that the Egyptians sell their land, their labor, and eventually enslave themselves to the crown. This chapter shows us the complicated relationship between the provision that empire provides and the cost of that provision. The whole narrative of Scripture wants us to see the deadly cost of empire, that Joseph is unwittingly paving the path for the enslavement of his own people in the future, and also wants us to ask, are there alternatives to empire that can provide provision for all without the deadly costs?
Genesis chapter 48. We're nearing the end of this book of beginnings, and in this chapter we find Jacob at the end of his life. Joseph brings his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, to Jacob for a blessing. And just as we've seen previously when it comes to 2 sons and a mixed up blessing, Jacob crosses his hands and gives the greater blessing to the younger child, an intentional choice that mirrors his own journey as he stole the blessing from his older brother. And when we see it happening here, perhaps we can finally notice this recurring theme found in this family system. The younger Isaac is favored over Ishmael. Jacob steals the birthright and blessing from his older brother Esau. Joseph, the second youngest, was always his father's favorite. And now the favorite son's second favorite son is shown all the favor from the patriarch. We often assume to know who deserves what. But time and time again, God challenges our expectations and subverts our understanding of who is to be blessed.
Genesis chapter 49.
Reuben, you are my might and the first fruits of my vigor.
Judah is a lion's whelp.
Issachar is a strong donkey.
Naphtali is a doe let loose that bears lovely fawns.
Benjamin is a ravenous wolf.
When Jacob ended his charge to his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. So if you're wondering how to bless your kids, I guess you could borrow this. But seriously, our words create worlds. What words are you speaking to the people in your life?
Genesis, the final chapter, chapter 50. Israel dies. And after a period of mourning, Joseph requests from Pharaoh the permission to take his father to the land of Canaan so that he can be buried where Abraham is buried, in this place that will become known as the Promised Land. Pharaoh says yes. The brothers are worried that now is the time that Joseph is going to enact his vengeance upon them for the horrible ways they treated him back in the day. But even after they beg for forgiveness, Joseph says, "Do not be afraid. Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, to preserve a numerous people, as God is doing today." But then Joseph dies. But before he passes, he tells his people that when God calls them out of Egypt, to please bring his body back to the land of Canaan, back to the land they were promised. The end of Genesis.